he basically said, ask me at the end of this term, like what my thoughts are about him. And so I think this is just kind of a general pattern of punching left and kind of trying to kneecap left progressive candidates and office holders. And you have to really look at it through the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is that he's the chairperson of this group called Majority Democrats. And Majority Democrats, it's kind of like the ugly stepchild of the Democratic Leadership Council, which is active in the 90s and then disbanded because there was essentially lack of interest. And now it's kind of like emerged again because there's all this Silicon Valley billionaire money to fund it. And so there's a article in that came out in the Lever News a few weeks ago that does a deep dive on what they call the billionaire machine that's behind majority Democrats. And so majority Democrats is not just a single group or pack. They have a majority Democrats pack, but there's also this network of nonprofits that are organized with it. And one of these nonprofits is the Searchlight Institute, which is kind of famous because every so often they come out with like a policy brief that kind of tries to punch left or undermine the left.
Right. We love to be heterodox.
Right. So notably, they came out like during the Minnesota ICE raids. They came out with a policy brief that said, actually, we shouldn't abolish ICE. What we should do is reform and retrain. And that, went over like a sack of bricks. Like
Yeah.
nobody liked it. And also in the Majority Democrats network is uh, several other kind of nonprofits and consultancies that are interlinked. And there's a few highly paid campaign consultants. One is Liz Smith, who kind of works between these nonprofits and then also within the campaign. So she's been paid. She's been active in the, I think, McMorrow campaign and the Tallarico campaign, and these are majority Democrats endorsed candidates. And the entire network is funded just by a handful of billionaires. So there's the Mendel's, who are from the tech billionaire sphere. There's Reid Hoffman, a few people from Facebook co-founders and NVIDIA co-founders and Tesla people. The spokesperson of Majority Democrats is a Tesla person. And so there's just like a lot of tech money behind it, and they promote this abundance agenda. And the abundance agenda essentially says, we want to build more, and in order to build more housing, and we have to deregulate. So they're all about deregulation and housing and energy. And this is kind of important because you'll never see a majority Democrat criticize a data center, right?
Sure.
And it's because they're getting all this Silicon Valley billionaire money, and they want these tech titans need to construct more data centers to support the AI models that are profiting their companies.
Which ties all the way back to what you do for a living. And so like just thinking about like Searchlight and majority Democrats and all them, it's interesting that their whole thing, and the people don't know, founded by some people who used to work for Harry Reid, but more centrist folks. They, like you said, financed by a lot of corporate money. Their whole thing is electability. They kind of say, hey, we're going to come up with electable ideas that people will vote Democrats for. But what's interesting is that we're seeing this year, whether it's Graham Plattner, whether it's Zoran obviously won. I'm in New York City, so we have that. There's just a bunch of Democrats that are like Peggy Flanagan's probably going to win in Minnesota, who's just more on the progressive end, and Angie Craig. Like maybe the left is more electable for like this kind of populist left that we're seeing rise up, and I think you consider yourself part of. And but the interesting about Octopus is he loves to talk about electability, talked about appealing to like the center, and there's that whole blue no matter who ethos, right? When it comes from the center always pushing to the left, but it doesn't seem like they're able to accept that there might be a more politically popular and populist option.
Right.
That they realize it is ideology, not electability.
Right. And the irony is that the majority Democrats' potential majority in the Senate essentially hinges on Maine. So if we're going to throw out the possibility of Graham Plattner beating Susan Collins in Maine, we're essentially throwing out the possibility of a Democratic majority, and that's what does that represent? That's 2 years of Trump potentially appointing a Supreme Court judge and additional federal judges, and so the amount of damage that these establishment Democrats are willing to do um, in order because they don't want to cede control to an insurgent left. I think that's what it's really about, and I think that's what the mission of majority Democrats is about. It's a counterbalance to the economic populism that's exemplified by Bernie Sanders and kind of the newer acolytes like Zoran Mamdani and also Graham Plattner, and it's trying to be a counterbalance. And I think they need all the billionaire money to make that balance because there's no grassroots or democratic base enthusiasm for what they're selling.
Yeah, I think for a long time there's this element of the timidity among Democrats voters who were just like, let's beat Republicans, let's beat Trump, let's beat Bush, whatever it was, get whoever we think can win electability. And I think they've kind of realized that maybe that what they thought was electability wasn't actually, it was just a cover for control, and also be like that maybe like you said, especially in this time of extreme inequality and inflation and whatnot, and data centers popping up everywhere, there is a populist element of electability that once you get past this, once you get past them talking about who can win, they ultimately just want control. Like you said, it's not about electability.
Hmm.
Um, Now I'm curious. You didn't. I mean, Auchincloss won in 2022 by they split There's a big split primary. A lot of people ran. He just snuck in there. We have this kind of similar situation here in New
Right,
York with Dan Goldman, who won in
right,
2022, just sneaking in there. He's probably going to lose his primary. He's running
right.
against Brad Landers, running against him. Auchincloss, I know he's from like a wealthier part of Boston, but it's a very liberal district. And
Right.
so, talk about kind of being represented by him over the last bunch of years, and what led you to decide,
Yeah.
you know what, I'm going to throw in before he even said this stuff about Plattner.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the district changed after 2020. So I wasn't in the district um, in 2020 when he won. So I almost didn't know much about him, and it wasn't until 2024 um, at the start of the Israel's aggression against um, Gaza that I really. It was actually before that. It was what really triggered me at first was the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh in the West Bank. That was I
A
think
journalist.
early 2024, and at that point, I started contacting my congresspeople, and I thought my congressperson was Catherine Clark because that's who it was in 2020. But it turns out it was Representative Auchincloss, and I had learned that he actually had taken a trip to Israel at the same time. It was like June 2024 that Shireen Abu Akleh was murdered, and it was just like 2 weeks after he was there, and he didn't say anything about it in the news publicly. There was no reporting that he had said anything to. He met Netanyahu. He met the military. There was no discussion of um, the IDF's conduct in the West Bank at that time. Um,
Big,
after
big miss on his part, right?
Right. And so, I started contacting his office at that time and was, very unimpressed with the responses. It was essentially these rote template responses about the importance of supporting Israel, our ally, or the only democracy in the Middle East. Um, and it was the same thing after October 7th. And I was a postdoc. So I did my PhD in political science at UC Berkeley and computational science and engineering, and I did a postdoc at Harvard Medical School in their Department of Healthcare Policy. So I was working in the intersection of statistics, AI, and health policy. And at that time, there were encampments at Harvard, and it was a big deal in the district in Cambridge and nationally. And I was also, writing Representative Auchincloss at that time, asking him, um, telling him that he should, support human rights for Palestinians and he should support the students' freedom of expression because the students were just asking to sit down with the administrators and not have their tuition money go towards arms manufacturers stocks, and they were met with just brutality. And Representative Auchincloss at that time was going to the in front of the media saying that Harvard was actually discriminating against Jewish and Israeli students, and that it was on Harvard to take down the encampments because it was infringing on the student rights. And he was also threatening federal funding away from Harvard and universities that had encampments. And so, in a real sense, he was laying the groundwork for Donald Trump's assault on the First Amendment and
Yep.
assault on academic freedom and the deportations of students that came after his
Right.
election. And I had written in 2024 during the encampments, I had written a bunch of um, signed on to a bunch of petitions from U.S. scholars to university presidents, asking them just to sit down with the students and hear their side of the story. And and for that activism, I got put on the infamous Israeli run doxing website. And
Oh,
so
wow.
and so that's what really kind of like triggered this thought of um, activism and what it means to be an activist and the importance of um, amplifying one's voice, because if one doesn't amplify their voice and there's no counterbalance to the other side, and the other side gets to define who you are.
Yeah.
And so I thought it was important to define my values for human rights, for free speech, and for peace in the Middle East. And so that was a very large reason why I decided to run this particular race.
Yeah, I mean, like, so I mean, to say the least, you're not like
Mm.
you weren't intending to be a politician. You're just trying to like,
No.
raise attention for something and get people to like, at the bare minimum, get heard, right? Have a congressman listen to somebody. It was it was this certainly. I mean, you were going for your doctorate in at Harvard for
Yeah.
statistics and medicine. It was not this was not your ambition.
It was not my ambition, and it was not something I was really thinking about until November of last year. And I do remember in 2024 in the Democratic primary, Auchincloss ran unopposed, and I was just, the pain of seeing, an empty ballot line. Um, it felt to me like democracy had failed, and like there was no option for people, to express their dissent. And because he wasn't really paying attention to his constituents, he, had a very good way of deflecting questions, especially around Israel. He would just deflect it away. And so I don't think there was really a mechanism for change. And so that was, why I ultimately decided to run, is because I didn't want to see another cycle of this representative running unopposed. And I really do think that he, throughout his 6 years in office, he has represented the big donor class, and he has not represented the people in this district.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, he's much more centrist, I think, than the district. When you think about like the Democratic, I guess the Democratic lean of this district, we're in Boston and Cambridge, and in Newton, all those places. It's pretty far to the left. Um, so, was there a moment where you're like, what, screw it, I'm going to do it? And then, like, once you did it, what kind of reception have you gotten from Democrats locally?
Yeah. So, so also about late last year when I was deciding, I was also I had finished my postdoc and I was contracting with an AI company, and so very interested in the impact of AI on society and the economy. And I was really also looking at statistics that were showing these massive layoffs, like 50,000 jobs laid off last year. projected layoffs about 7% of the entire workforce over the entire decade. And so I was thinking, well, this is really the time to escalate demands for big progressive universal policies like Medicare for all. And so, um, I supported Medicare for all before the rise of AI. So I was active as a volunteer in the Bernie Sanders 2020 campaign. At the time, I was in North Carolina. I was knocking on doors, canvassing, and I was always bringing up Medicare for all. Um, there were two studies that came out at the time, one in the Lancet, actually both in the Lancet, and one of them said that Medicare for all would save about 240 billion a year and 67,000 lives a year. And so and that's because the administrative overhead of the Medicare program is so much lower compared to private insurance. So the administrative overhead of Medicare is about 8%, and then private insurance is 20%. And it saves, lives because all these people who don't qualify for Medicaid, um, because their income is above the threshold, but don't have enough money or don't have the employment to have health insurance. So without Medicare for all, like they're vulnerable. And so
Yeah.
I also think like in a time where AI is potentially displacing all these jobs and both white collar and blue collar jobs, it's really important to decouple health insurance with employment. And so
No.
I think the Medicare for all plan is the way to go. And
And
I'll go ahead.
no, no, I mean, like, and you mentioned, like, that's a big one for you. I'm looking through your issue pages, and you mentioned doing the AI stuff, and that's, I
Mm.
mean, couldn't be more timely, right? With AI kind of running things. So I'm curious about your experience with AI, and you talking about data centers, you talking about when you talking about like tax and automating jobs and robots. So I'm really curious about where you stand on that because I think it was 2023. I think I remember Auchincloss, he wrote, I guess he delivered the first speech written by ChatGPT in
Right.
Congress, which like is a funny thing to brag about back then, but especially now.
Well, yeah,
Looking back on it.
but what he wouldn't brag about, I think, now is that the fact that so he was doing that speech as a way to demonstrate a beneficial co-alliance between um, U.S. and Israel in terms of shared technology. Um, but like OpenAI wasn't an Israeli firm, so it like made entirely no sense. And so the entire point of the exercise was just very vapid. Um, but so I mean, to your point, there are multiple ways of looking at the threat of AI in terms of safety, but the one that I'm really focusing on in this campaign is the threat of AI on workers
Mhm.
and also communities. So um, I focus a lot on the need to strengthen worker power in the form of collective bargaining, principally by passing the PRO Act. And a reason for that is because um, workers are losing power in their workforce and they don't have much control over how AI is deployed in the workforce. And there's a couple of examples of this in the Writers Guild in Hollywood. The workers successfully went on strike, demanding protections against AI generated like scripts and production. Um, in New York City, this last summer, the New York City nurses went on strike because AI was being deployed in the clinical setting when patients went into um, a clinical setting. They were often greeted with a chatbot instead of a human. So, like the chatbot
Crazy.
would do the intake, whereas normally it would be like a nurse or a healthcare worker. And so they wanted control over that aspect because they thought that this the corporate hospitals were using AI to displace them in some of their basic job functions. And so the nurses in that case were also successful in uh, organizing and reaching an agreement with the hospitals.
Right.
And So I really do think of AI as having a, it's the trajectory is it's going to have a negative impact on workers and worker power. It's also having already a negative impact on communities in terms of these construction of these AI data centers, and uh, we see especially in uh, it's called like data center row in Northern Virginia. There's
Mm,
detrimental environmental impacts and there's detrimental health impacts. The data centers can be, they can deplete water supplies because they use a lot of water to cool the GPUs that run the AI models, and they can have negative impacts on air quality because of the power generators, and they can have negative impacts on one's environment because they produce this like low hum that um, can be like deleterious to one's health. And so, um, I think it is like very hopeful to see there's this populist pushback against data centers, and it's bipartisan. It's not like a left right thing. It's just people in their community speaking out against these huge companies. And in my district in Mansfield, they just passed the town hall meeting passed a uh, preemptive ban on AI data centers and data centers in general. So even like traditional data centers that run um, like computational computing
right.
for research labs, for instance. They set
Yeah.
like a limit on the amount of energy required for these data centers, and it passed unanimously in Mansfield Town Hall. And Mansfield it's a blue town, but it's not like Cambridge or Brookline where it's like very liberal or left.
It's a very populous issue for sure. And like, I'm
Mhm.
curious, like for you, I mean, I covered data centers a lot, or I work at a place that doesn't. Um, for someone who works in AI, right, or works in the AI research and stuff, but tell me about like your relationship to it and the kind of stuff you do, and like how you think it can be used effectively, but also what we should like, how government should regulate it, because I think that's a big part of it. Like, there was a lot of hype around AI a few years ago, and now all
Mhm.
of a sudden, a lot of like Jake Auchincloss were getting behind it and hyping it up, and now all of a sudden they're finding themselves, oh, we got to do something about it. We got to like seem at least like we're doing something about it. But how do you think the government should be involved in it? Because it's a tricky question.
Yeah, it's there's no question that AI can enhance productivity in certain tasks, such as coding. Um, so I was on a research paper called Terminal Bench, which benchmarked different AI models on real world tasks in the terminal. So these are like command line tasks
Hmm.
that might take days to complete for a human to complete. And so the question is like, how well do these models compare with each other and also over time in completing these tasks? And what we've seen in the past year or two is that the effectiveness of the models on these real world tasks that are produced by human experts has increased like rapidly over time. And so um, the models are definitely getting smarter, um, and they can do more and more of work that humans can do. And there are different ways that the government, I think, can get involved or be more proactive in terms of making sure that AI is deployed safely. And one thing is that we see governments such as in Massachusetts, the state government, the governor has adopted a contract with OpenAI to use AI, um, ChatGPT, in government agencies. And so, this is concerning on multiple fronts, but uh, the first thing is concerning is that these models are ingesting, you know, private, confidential data and data that has a lot of personal details about people. So like hospital records, medical records, unemployment records, anything that a state agency can touch, it's going to be ingested by ChatGPT. And
Right.
so, they claim the state government and OpenAI claims that there's a strict firewall. So, um, the Massachusetts government will have its own ChatGPT, but um, you know, we've seen these models and these companies screw up all the time. It's like, you know, the current Iran conflict started with a bombing on a girls' school in Manab in Iran, and that's because um, the Anthropic's Claude model was fed this data that said, oh, this school is actually a military base because the data that Palantir got was like maybe like 10 years old or something, and maybe
Right.
the school was tangential to a military base, and so the models screw up all the time, and there has to be human oversight, and we can't just trust these AI companies that are just irresponsible to do the work of protecting people's privacy. And so I think that's really concerning. I don't think that the government should have contracts with companies like OpenAI and Anthropic to deploy these models within the government, because I think there's too much power. There's too much, I think, too much power that these companies then receive to have, influence within the government. Um, and now they're also creating these packs. So OpenAI and Anthropic have their own like dueling political action
Yeah.
committees, and they're pouring like all this money into Democratic primaries all across the country right now. And so I think they're getting too much power, and they're expending too much political power. And so, and what they really want is that they don't want the national government to institute robust AI safety
Right.
legislation. Um, and they actually want the government to have like a weak federal framework to override state frameworks, because there are state governments like New York and Illinois that are implementing uh, strong, pr- strong AI safety laws at the state level. And so that's what they're really scared about. And so they want to elect Congress people who will go to Congress and then vote for like kind of like a weak federal framework that would override the stronger
Right.
frameworks.
Yeah, no, we're seeing that. I live in New York 12, which is where like Alex Wars is running for Congress, and it's been just tons of money going. I see commercials nonstop. Make it seem like it's funny that like the AI, Open AI, and all these people are trying to make him seem like he's more pro AI. They know that's how popular they are. Trying to make it seem like he's like the pro AI guy. Um, but just looking at your policies on your website, there's a lot of stuff there about either mitigating or preparing for the harms. But you've got like the robot tax, which I know Bernie Sanders suggested, and cite South Korea as they've got a way to like sort of make people who automate jobs pay into like a social fund. It is just protecting workers from AI displacement in terms of changing tax incentives and whatnot. And so I'm curious, like, what would you? It's a big deal for you in that sense, and like, what would you like to how do we protect workers along with like collective bargaining? Like, what are the things that you want to see happen?
Hmm. Yeah. So the trajectory we were on right now is kind of coalescing economic and political power uh, among the like a handful of tech companies at the expense of workers and at the expense of communities. And so, what we really have to do is have to have like federal legislation counteract that. And I mentioned the PRO Act, so it's really important that workers have the power to organize and have the power to have a seat at the table and uh, decide how AI is deployed in their workforce. And something I hear on the campaign trail actually is that the idea of mandating that corporate boards are staffed by a certain percentage of union members, and so this is something they do in European countries such as Germany. And so they
Hmm.
have, I think, like 30% of a corporate board has to be staffed by a union member, and I think that's like a really good idea too. And so we should be looking at different ways in which we can increase worker power, and we can increase the right to organize. Um, but yeah, in terms of the automation tax, I think the automation tax uh, can be used to fund something like a universal basic income.
Right.
So, um, there's legislation in Congress right now that would provide $250 a month to every adult in this country. It's the tax is structured in such a way that households earning up to 180,000 a year would see a net benefit. Um, and I think it could be structured in a different way. We could fund a UBI through automation tax. We can fund a UBI through a token tax. So the larger models, um, they're, they the larger models consume more tokens, and so the tokens are like the elements, the set of words and phrases um, that the LLM is trained on,
Right.
and the bigger the more tokens that are expended, it can be taxed, and so um, I think that's another way to fund a UBI creatively, and so
Yeah, I use yeah, I feel like I was making my life easier to try and take notes, right? So I made like a extension on Claude that allowed me to just highlight stuff and send it to Google Doc, right?
Mhm.
And it was like how many it had all these like is exponentially adding
Mhm.
token used, and I just like I have no I have no gauge. You have to buy tokens. I have no gauge of like what they're worth, and like it seems it's almost like being in an arcade. You just end up with this like cache of a whole bunch of like coins from that has no actual material value, but ends up costing like people like $500 million, companies $500 million for these tokens, and so it's almost feels like it's set up to like rip you off in a way.
Right, and in the amount of money they're spending on running these models is like incredible. So they're not a lot of these companies like OpenAI, like they're not like making enough profit to pay for the cost of these models in terms of energy expenditure. And so that's why there's so much focus on constructing these AI data centers as a way to kind of create the infrastructure in which these models can continue to run. And that's why, like, late last year, Sam Altman went to Congress or wrote a letter to Congress basically saying that, like, hey, you guys might have to bail us out because you didn't say those words directly, but that was the point of the letter. Like, we're spending all this money on AI data centers, and it's not just us, it's also NVIDIA, which makes the GPU chips. Together, we're spending billions of dollars on these data centers. And if the AI project just goes bust, people stop using it, or um, competition from China. And so the Chinese companies, they found a way to construct and run these large language models in such a way that doesn't cost so much in terms of energy output, or it doesn't have as much of a financial cost because they're smaller models, they're more efficient. And so there's a risk that that competition from China is going to drive the companies like OpenAI out of business, and there's going to be all these empty data centers, just like spinning their wheels, and so it does create this like massive massive risk for the U.S. economy, and so that's why Sam Altman is saying, well, the the federal government might have to like help bail us out because of this.
Yeah, it seems like it's the one growth industry in the United States, but it's not actually like, making any money. So we're like our economy is sort of like hinging on these companies selling compute power to each other,
Yeah,
and kind of funding one another. And like I'm sure seeing it from the inside, it's just even more precarious than it seems.
yeah. And there was also a letter by the um, White House Technology Council um, warning about competition from AI and from China, and how Chinese companies are distilling um, learned behavior from American models and using that in their own models as like kind of copyright infringement almost. And they're saying, well, this is actually a national security threat because we can't our AI models can't be outpaced by Chinese models, which is kind of ridiculous argument because the Chinese models are are open weight, and so like they're much more open about how their models are built than these frontier labs in the United States, such as Anthropic and OpenAI.
Well, it's funny for them to complain about copyright infringement when all of AI LLMs are based on
Right.
copyright
Exactly.
infringement. Yeah, they build their models on stuff they scrape from
Yeah.
the internet, even if they don't have the rights to it.
Right. And so that's another reason why we should have something like a UBI is because, um, like Gemini, for instance, the Google's model, I think it was found out that they use the entire like digitized library of the world, like all the books that have been digitized in since
Wow.
the start of so like hundreds of years of literature and research and people's creative output has been fed into these models and um, are now being used to enhance the profit of particular companies. Whereas nobody who wrote these books gave their permission or consent that their output would be used to train these models. And so I think that's another reason why we should have something like a UBI is because it's you can think of it as kind of a dividend for
Right.
people's output being used to enhance the profit of these companies.
I mean, look, I'm like my background is as a writer,
Mm.
and so that's like the number one job being threatened by AI. But even things like we're doing right now, it will eventually live as a podcast, right? Live as a YouTube video, it'll live as a podcast, and like now Spotify wants to make AI like personalized podcasts. It feels like it's sort of like a runaway train. And like, how do we get our arms around it? It's so yeah, so I'm curious, like this campaign, what does it look like? I imagine you've gotten a lot more attention this week after what Oculus said. Like, how has that changed things?
Yeah, so I would say like before like we would encounter a lot of voters who are Democrats who shared our campaign's values. So they like the message of Medicare for all. They like the message of strengthening collective bargaining rights. They wanted to end the foreign wars and bring the money back to our communities. And they just kind of assumed that Representative Auchincloss shared those values. And
Mm,
um, I had to say, like, actually, no, he has not co-sponsored the Medicare for All Act. He actually he wrote that he doesn't believe in Medicare for all, and he doesn't believe in it because he thinks that you know the government can't run like a healthcare program, even though Medicare is a successful and popular program among people who have it,
been doing it
and
for years.
right, and it's also it polls very well among people when asked. It's between um, you know, 50 to 80%, depending on who you're asking and how it's asked. So it's a popular idea. Um, up until last week, Representative Auchincloss never co-sponsored a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United, and so when I told voters that, they would be shocked because they just would kind of assume that a Democrat would support getting big money out of politics. And I told this to a reporter I think 2 weeks ago, and the reporter then followed up with Representative Auchincloss's office and said, Jason Poulos says that he's never co-sponsored a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United. And they replied, well, actually, he has. And the next day, Representative Auchincloss co-sponsored the Citizens Over Corporations Amendment, and which has been in the current Congress for 16 months without his
Right.
signature.
It's clearly very
So
real
he
conviction.
co-sponsored it the next day, and so
But
um, yeah, I was always wondering like why wouldn't he, just because why wouldn't he just co-sponsor that amendment? Like it doesn't, cost him anything, but he does accept. So he accepted about 500,000 in corporate PAC donations last cycle, and so and like I was explaining earlier, like his majority Democrats
right,
network, it relies on huge amounts of funding from several billionaires, and they're also spending the money in such a way that um, that stretches thin the already, you know, already weak federal finance regulations that were created after, as a result of Citizens United's decision. And so, and I mean, they're essentially coordinating between these groups. So they're
Mhm.
coordinating between the majority Democrats PAC, Searchlight Institute, and there's a consultancy, and there are several staffers that are working between these nonprofits and also within the campaigns. So they're absolutely coordinating, which is unlawful under our current weak
Right.
um, uh, structure. And so yeah, and so I think like the this race is changing rapidly. Like we've already gotten the congressman to flip on this key position. And so after these comments, I get a lot of emails from people, voters living in the district, saying, I just, I thought he was just fine. I thought
Right.
he was just kind of like just fine, and it wasn't like an important thing. But after these comments, um, it really kind of struck a nerve because what he's basically saying is that he doesn't care if Republicans retain the Senate. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, and I imagine it's like that as a wake-up call to people, and, like, kind of, like, makes them look into who he is and what his deal was, and it's amazing, thinking about going back to 2024 and, again, I'm in New York City, and so Columbia was sort of like the vanguard of
yeah.
the protests, and, we had, people like, Josh Gottheimer, who's a Democrat from New Jersey, coming in and, slamming the protesters and students and whatnot. And now it's like
Mm.
it's changed so quickly, and it feels like the politics of that has changed so quickly. Politics of AI has changed so quickly. It feels like we're in this time where um, you know, some of it's more populist than other, but just the everything's kind of being turned on its head in terms of what Democratic voters seem to care about and what they believe they've been sort of unleashed, I guess.
Right. And um, so, Representative Auchincloss, as you might know, has taken over $1 million since 2020 from APAC and its subsidiaries. And not just APAC, also NORPAC, which is kind of like the Republican APAC. He's only recently taken money from DMFI, which is like the Democratic
Mhm.
APAC. So he was basically more too right wing for DMFI for a while. Uh, I think this cycle was the first time that J Street, which is kind of like the liberal Zionist group, donated to him and endorsed him. And so because before that they considered him too right wing for their group. Um, and so the politics around this issue have changed, rapidly. Now, you know, the vast majority of Democrats want there to be no additional funding for Israel's war on Gaza, on the West Bank, and on Iran. And so um, this is now an increasingly popular position. This is the position that I'm taking in this campaign. That if elected, I would not send any additional money in offensive or defensive or economic aid to Israel. I don't think that um, their values are consistent with our laws, and so we have like Leahy laws that mandate that any recipient of American foreign aid has to abide by international human rights standards, which Israel is not. And so, even by our own laws, like Israel should not be the recipient of American foreign aid. And so, I'm making this position clear in this race, and I think that I think it's kind of like the modal position in the Democratic Party in this district.
Yeah, I mean, you've got and like wrap it up, but you like to wrap it up. Don't take too much of your time, but like you've got all summer basically to build momentum and to he's got a lot of
Yeah.
money in his war chest. But what's the grassroots way of getting him? What's your plan to win?
Yeah, so the Auchincloss's CNN comments actually is timed really well for this campaign. So we just got onto the ballot on May 5th.
Right.
Um, and we actually did so days before Representative Auchincloss did. And the way we did that is we had over 100 volunteers collecting signatures and we collected signatures in 32 of the 35 towns and cities in the district. And so the way forward is by brute force and by brute force among uh, an army of volunteers. And so we have um, over 150 volunteers signed up through our website. We have over 100 people active on Discord, and so we have a campaign Discord in which we're organizing events, and we're tossing around ideas, and it's very decentralized. It's very non-hierarchical. We don't have any paid staff, and when I tell people in who have been around campaigns for a while that we don't have any paid staff, that's usually when they stop listening. But I think it's kind of like to our advantage because um, we can act quicker. We can act more brazen. We're not trying to, we're not confined by a box. And so the campaign can, I think, blow up like really quickly. And I think we're kind of like seeing that happen after these comments. Um, this is like when we're starting to get attention from, um, other people within the Democratic Party and other people online. And so I think it's just going to grow from here.
Yeah, no, it's certainly one of the things where if it's a year to be a primary challenger, it is this year.
Yeah. And on the timeline, like as you noted, the Democratic primary is September 1st, so it's one of the last Democratic primaries in the country, and so I think we're also going to benefit by the fact that like most of the marquee races are going to be done by June, and so
Mm,
we're going to have a lot of attention on this race. I think after the New York primary in at the end of June.
absolutely. Well, we'll cede attention to you happily. Messing here in New York. But listen, how can people find your campaign and join your Discord and get involved?
Yeah, so the website is poulos.house, poulos.house, and there's a Discord invite on the social media nav bar, and if you live in the district, you can sign up to volunteer, and yeah, so we're growing the volunteer base, and we're starting to canvass and knock on doors, and that's like the other thing. Like the online thing is important, and content creation is important, but it's also very important that we knock on doors to spread the message because not everyone is on in these social media channels, and so we have to like actually show up on their doorstep to spread the word.
Awesome. Listen, good luck with everything. We'll stay in touch, and thanks for doing this.
Great, thanks so much, Jordan.
All right, take care. Jason Pulitzer, everyone.
Bye bye.